The sound of gravel crunching under patrol car tires shattered the peaceful morning silence at our lake cabin. I watched in disbelief as two police officers stepped out of their vehicles, their faces serious and official. My wife stood on our dock, coffee mug still in her hand, watching them approach with a calm that I could not understand. Across the lake, I could see Karen standing on her deck with her arms crossed, a satisfied smirk spreading across her face. She had finally done it. She had called the police to have my wife removed from our own property. What Karen did not know was that she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. The woman she was trying to have arrested was not just any ordinary homeowner. My wife was the superintendent of state police, and Karen was about to learn that some battles you simply cannot win. After 15 years of marriage and countless weekends spent looking at properties we could not afford, Sarah and I finally found our dream. The lake cabin sat on a small rise overlooking Crystal Lake, with 40 feet of private shoreline and a dock that stretched into water so clear you could see the bottom 12 feet down. The realtor handed me the keys on a Friday afternoon in late spring. Sarah had to work late that night, but I drove up alone just to sit on the dock and watch the sunset. The water was like glass, reflecting the pine trees and the mountains beyond. Loons called from somewhere across the lake, their haunting voices echoing off the water. I had never felt such peace. When Sarah finally arrived the next morning, she found me already on the dock with 2 cups of coffee and a huge grin. She kicked off her shoes and sat beside me, her feet dangling in the cool water. "It is perfect," she said, leaning against my shoulder. "I cannot believe it is really ours." Sarah worked in law enforcement, a job that demanded long hours and carried heavy responsibilities. She rarely talked about the specifics of her work, but I could see the weight she carried in her shoulders at the end of difficult days. The cabin was supposed to be our escape from all of that. Those first few weeks were everything we had dreamed of. We spent lazy Saturday mornings fishing from the dock, catching bass and sunfish that we would clean and cook for dinner. Sunday afternoons were for kayaking around the lake, exploring the quiet coves and hidden beaches. Evenings were for sitting by the fire pit, watching the stars emerge over the water. The neighborhood seemed perfect too. The homeowners association had reasonable rules about maintaining the natural beauty of the area. Most of our neighbors were friendly folks who had been coming to the lake for years. The Johnsons next door brought us fresh tomatoes from their garden. The elderly couple across the cove always waved when they saw us on the dock. But there was one neighbor who seemed different. Her name was Margaret, though everyone called her by her maiden name, Karen. She lived in the largest house on the lake, a year-round resident who had moved there after her divorce. Karen always seemed to be watching from her deck, and I noticed she had a pair of binoculars that she used frequently. "She is probably just a bird watcher," Sarah said when I mentioned it. "Lots of people are into that here." But something about the way Karen watched us felt different. It was not the casual interest of a friendly neighbor. It was the focused attention of someone keeping track of everything we did. I told myself I was being paranoid. We had worked so hard to get here, saved every penny for years to afford this place. Sarah deserved to have somewhere peaceful to unwind from her demanding career. I was not going to let my imagination ruin that for us. The lake was our sanctuary now. Every weekend we would pack up and drive the hour and a half from the city, leaving behind the noise and stress of our regular lives. Here, there were no deadlines, no emergencies, no constant pressure. Just the two of us, the water, and the peaceful rhythm of lake life. As we sat on the dock that first month, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, I thought we had finally found our piece of paradise. The water lapped gently against the dock posts, and somewhere in the distance, a loon called to its mate. I had no idea that our peace was about to be shattered by the woman watching us from across the lake. The first violation notice appeared in our mailbox on a Tuesday morning in July. I read it twice before I could believe what I was seeing. According to the letter, our dock umbrella was non-compliant with community standards due to its blue and white striped pattern. Blue and white stripes are not approved colors, the letter stated. All umbrellas must be solid forest green or tan to maintain the natural aesthetic of the lake community. Sarah laughed when I showed her the letter. "You have got to be kidding me. Who even notices these things?" But I had a sinking feeling I knew exactly who had noticed. Karen lived directly across the lake from us, with a perfect view of our dock and umbrella. Over the past few weeks, I had seen her out on her deck with those binoculars more and more frequently. The second violation came 3 days later. This time, it was about our kayaks. Apparently, storing them upside down on the dock was improper storage that creates visual clutter. The letter included a photograph of our kayaks taken from across the lake. "She is photographing our property," I told Sarah, holding up the grainy image. "This is getting weird." Sarah frowned as she studied the photo. "Let me make some calls. Maybe we can talk to someone reasonable in the HOA." But Karen was not done. Over the next 2 weeks, we received 4 more violation notices. Our outdoor furniture was the wrong style. Our fire pit was too close to the water. Our car was parked at the wrong angle in our own driveway. Each letter came with photographs and increasingly aggressive language about maintaining community standards. I decided to drive over and try to talk to Karen directly. Her house was the biggest on the lake, a sprawling ranch with manicured landscaping and a deck that wrapped around 3 sides. As I walked up to her front door, I could see she had been watching me approach through her window. "Can I help you?" she asked, opening the door before I could knock. "Hi, I am Dave from across the lake. I wanted to talk to you about these HOA violations." Karen crossed her arms and gave me a cold stare. "What about them? You are not following the rules." "I am happy to follow reasonable rules," I said, trying to keep my voice friendly. "But some of these seem pretty minor. Maybe we could work something out." "Minor?" Karen's voice rose. "Do you know what happens to property values when people start ignoring the rules? I have lived here for 8 years, and I have worked hard to maintain the quality of this community." "I understand, but surely a striped umbrella is not going to hurt anyone." "It is not about the umbrella," Karen snapped. "It is about respect for the community and following the rules that everyone else manages to follow just fine." I could feel this conversation going nowhere fast. "Look, we just want to enjoy our property peacefully. We are not trying to cause any trouble." "Then follow the rules," Karen said, and slammed the door in my face. When I got home, Sarah was waiting with another letter. This one was different. It was not a violation notice but a formal warning about repeated noncompliance and failure to maintain community standards. It was signed by Karen as HOA Compliance Officer. "She gave herself a title," Sarah said, shaking her head. "This woman has way too much time on her hands." But it was more than that. Over the following weeks, Karen ramped up her surveillance. She started timing our activities, nodding when we arrived and left. She filed complaints about the volume of our music, even though we barely played it loud enough to hear ourselves. She objected to the type of fish we were catching, claiming that bass fishing was disruptive to the ecosystem. Other neighbors started avoiding us. The Johnsons stopped bringing tomatoes. The elderly couple across the cove stopped waving. Karen had been talking to them, spreading stories about how we were problem residents who did not respect the community. The breaking point came on a Saturday evening in August. Sarah and I were having a quiet dinner on the dock when Corinne appeared in a kayak, paddling directly toward our property. "You need to move your dinner table," she called out while still 20 feet from shore. "Eating on the dock violates health and safety regulations." "This is our property," Sarah said calmly. "We can eat wherever we want on our own dock." Corinne's face flushed red. "Not if it violates HOA rules, you cannot. I am warning you both right now. If you do not start following every single rule in this community, I will take more serious action." "What does that mean?" I asked. Corinne smiled, but it was not a friendly expression. "It means I will bring in the authorities to make sure you comply. There are laws about this stuff, and I know how to use them." She paddled away, leaving Sarah and me staring at each other across our ruined dinner. The peaceful lake evening had turned into something much darker. That night I could not sleep. I kept thinking about Corinne's threat and the way she had said authorities. This was no longer about umbrellas and kayaks. This was about power, and Corinne was just getting started. The war escalated when Corinne discovered we were planning a small family barbecue for Labor Day weekend. My brother and his wife were coming up from the city, along with Sarah's parents. It was going to be 6 people total, hardly a wild party. But Corinne had other ideas. The letter arrived on a Wednesday, this time sent by certified mail. The return address listed Corinne as Chairman, HOA Compliance Committee. I had never heard of this committee before, but the letter was official-looking with formal letterhead and legal language. "Outdoor gatherings of more than 4 people require prior written approval from the HOA board," the letter stated. "Failure to obtain proper permits may result in fines, legal action, and forced removal of guests from the premises." Sarah was furious when she read it. "This is harassment, plain and simple. There is no way this kind of rule would hold up anywhere." But when we called the official HOA board to complain, we discovered something disturbing. Corinne had been busy. She had convinced 2 other residents to join her compliance committee and had been lobbying the board to adopt stricter rules. "She has been very persuasive," the board president told me over the phone. "She has documentation of multiple violations and concerns about property values. The board has voted to support her recommendations." The recommendations were brutal. New rules about noise levels, guest policies, property modifications, and community standards that seemed designed specifically to target us. Each rule came with mandatory fines and escalating penalties. But Corinne was not content to work through official channels. She launched a campaign to turn the entire neighborhood against us. She went door to door with photographs of our violations and stories about how we were destroying the character of the lake community. "They are city people," she told anyone who would listen. "They do not understand how to live in a place like this. They are going to ruin it for everyone." The psychological warfare was relentless. Corinne started documenting everything we did with military precision. She timed our arrival and departure. She photographed our guests. She measured the volume of our conversations with a decibel meter. Sarah tried to maintain her composure, but I could see the stress building. This was supposed to be our sanctuary, our escape from the pressures of her high-stress job. Instead, it had become another battlefield. "Maybe we should just sell," I suggested one evening after finding another violation notice tucked under our windshield wipers. "No," Sarah said firmly. "We worked too hard to get here. I am not going to let some bully drive us away from our own property. But the harassment was taking its toll. Sarah started working late more often, avoiding the cabin on weekends when she knew Karen would be watching. I found myself checking the mailbox with dread, wondering what new violation would be waiting. The final confrontation came on a Friday evening in September. Sarah and I were sitting on the dock, having a quiet conversation about whether to winterize the cabin early and avoid the hassle. Karen appeared on her deck with a megaphone. "You need to remove that fire pit immediately," her amplified voice echoed across the water. "It violates the new safety regulations." Sarah stood up, her jaw clenched. "We have had enough of this." She started walking toward Karen's property, but I caught her arm. "Do not give her what she wants. She is trying to provoke us." Karen kept going with the megaphone. "If you do not comply within 24 hours, I will file a formal complaint with the county authorities. You will be held legally responsible for any violations." That night, Karen made good on her threat. She filed complaints with the county health department, the fire marshal, and the Environmental Protection Agency. She claimed we were operating an illegal campground, violating fire safety codes, and polluting the lake with improper sewage disposal. None of it was true, but it did not matter. Each agency had to investigate. Each investigation meant inspectors coming to our property, asking questions, and treating us like criminals. The stress was unbearable. Sarah barely slept. I found myself jumping every time a car pulled into our driveway, wondering if it was another inspector or official. But the worst part was the isolation. Karen had successfully turned most of our neighbors against us. People who had been friendly now avoided eye contact. The lake community that had welcomed us was now hostile territory. On the last weekend of September, Karen delivered her final ultimatum. She came to our door with a thick folder of documentation and a legal-looking letter. "This is your last chance," she said, her voice cold and triumphant. "You have 30 days to comply with every single rule in this community or face serious consequences." "What kind of consequences?" Sarah asked. Karen's smile was predatory. "I will have you removed from this property by whatever means necessary. I know people in law enforcement and they will back me up. You do not belong here, and I will make sure everyone knows it." As she walked away, I felt something break inside me. This was no longer about HOA rules or community standards. This was about a woman who had decided to destroy us for the crime of wanting to enjoy our own property. Sarah watched Karen disappear into the darkness, her face grim. "She has no idea who she is dealing with," she said quietly. I thought I heard something dangerous in my wife's voice, but I was too angry and exhausted to pay attention. All I could think about was how our dream had become a nightmare. It was 8:30 on a Saturday morning when Karen made her final move. Sarah and I were having coffee on the dock, enjoying one of the last warm mornings of October. The lake was perfectly still, with mist rising from the water and the autumn colors reflecting like a painting. Then I heard the sound that would change everything, the crunch of gravel under heavy tires. 2 patrol cars pulled into our driveway, their lights flashing but sirens silent. My heart stopped as I watched 4 officers get out of their vehicles, their faces serious and official. This was not a social visit. "Sarah," I whispered, but she was already standing, her coffee mug steady in her hands despite the situation. The lead officer approached our dock, his hand resting casually on his radio. "Excuse me, folks. We received a complaint about trespassing on this property. We need to speak with you." I felt my face flush with anger and embarrassment. "Trespassing? This is our property. We own this place. Sir, I understand your frustration, but we have to respond to all calls. The complaint states that someone is illegally occupying this property without permission. Across the lake, I could see Karen standing on her deck. Even from that distance, I could make out the satisfied expression on her face. She had actually done it. She had called the police to have us removed from our own cabin. Who made this complaint? Sarah asked, her voice calm and professional. A neighbor called it in this morning. She provided documentation that suggests there may be some legal issues with the property ownership. I started to protest, but Sarah held up her hand. Officer, could I see your identification, please? The request seemed to surprise him, but he showed her his badge. Sarah studied it carefully, then nodded. And your partner? Both officers showed their credentials. Sarah examined each one with the kind of attention to detail that made me realize she was operating in a different mode now. This was not my wife having coffee on the dock. This was someone else entirely. We have all our ownership documents inside, Sarah said. Would you like to see them? That would be helpful, ma'am. As we walked toward the cabin, I could see Karen watching through her binoculars. Her triumph was complete. She had finally found a way to humiliate us in front of the entire lake community. Inside the cabin, Sarah pulled out our property deed, mortgage documents, and insurance papers. She laid them out on the kitchen table with the precision of someone who had done this before. The officers examined the paperwork carefully. I could see confusion growing on their faces as they realized the complaint was completely baseless. These documents appear to be in order, the lead officer said slowly. The property is clearly registered to both of you. Then why are we having this conversation? I asked, my anger finally boiling over. Sir, we have to respond to all complaints. The person who called this in seemed very convinced that there were legal issues. Sarah stepped forward. Officer, may I ask what specific allegations were made? The caller stated that you were squatting on property that belonged to the HOA due to unpaid fines and violations. She said she had documentation proving you had lost your right to occupy the premises. I wanted to scream. Karen had fabricated an entire legal scenario to get us kicked out of our own home, but Sarah remained perfectly calm. I see. And did the caller provide any actual legal documents to support these claims? Well, no. She said she would provide them if needed. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. Officers, I appreciate you doing your job, but I think you may want to document this complaint very carefully. False reports can be serious legal issues. Something in her tone made both officers look at her more closely. There was an authority in her voice that had not been there before. Ma'am, do you work in law enforcement? The younger officer asked. Sarah smiled, but it was not a friendly expression. I do, and I can tell you that filing false police reports is a crime in this state. The officers exchanged glances. I could see them beginning to understand that this situation was not what they had expected. We are going to need to document this incident thoroughly, the lead officer said. Would you be willing to provide a statement about the harassment you have been experiencing? As Sarah began describing Karen's months-long campaign of violations and threats, I watched the officers' expressions change from routine response to genuine concern. This was not a simple neighbor dispute. This was systematic harassment that had escalated to filing false police reports. Through the window, I could see Karen still watching from her deck, but something had changed in her posture. She was leaning forward, straining to see what was happening in our cabin. The confident smirk was gone, replaced by uncertainty. The officers spent over an hour documenting everything. They photographed the violation notices, recorded Sarah's statement, and took detailed notes about the harassment campaign. When they finally prepared to leave, the lead officer looked troubled. "Ma'am, you may want to consider filing a formal complaint about this situation. What you have described could constitute criminal harassment." Sarah nodded slowly. "I am considering all of my options, officer. Thank you for your professionalism." As the patrol cars pulled away, I expected to feel relief. Instead, I felt something much more dangerous: anticipation. Sarah stood in our doorway, watching the cars disappear down the lake road. Her face was calm, but I could see something calculating in her eyes. "Sarah, what are you thinking?" She turned to me with an expression I had never seen before. It was not anger or frustration. It was the look of someone who had just been handed all the ammunition they needed to end a war. "I am thinking that Karen has no idea what she has just done," she said quietly. "But she is about to find out." The return visit happened 3 hours later. I was cleaning up the breakfast dishes when I heard the familiar sound of tires on gravel. Through the window, I could see the same patrol cars returning, but this time they were followed by a third vehicle, an unmarked sedan with government plates. Sarah was on the phone in the living room, speaking in the low, authoritative tone she used for work calls. When she saw the cars arriving, she ended her conversation and walked outside to meet them. "Officers," she said, approaching the lead patrolman, "I appreciate you coming back so quickly." "Ma'am, we need to discuss this situation further. There have been some developments." Sarah nodded. "I thought there might be. Before we continue, I need to provide you with some information that may be relevant to your investigation." She reached into her purse and pulled out a leather wallet. When she opened it, I could see a badge and official identification. The officers leaned forward to examine it, and I watched their faces change completely. "Ma'am, are you?" The younger officer started, then stopped. "Superintendent Sarah Mitchell, State Police," she said calmly. "I have been the head of this division for 3 years." The silence that followed was deafening. Both officers straightened up, their entire demeanor shifting from casual investigation to formal respect. "Superintendent Mitchell," the lead officer said, clearly struggling to process this information. "We had no idea when you said you worked in law enforcement." "I prefer to keep my personal life separate from my professional responsibilities," Sarah replied. "But given the circumstances, I felt it was important to clarify my position." I stared at my wife in amazement. I knew she was high-ranking in state law enforcement, but I had never fully understood just how high. Superintendent was the top position in the entire state police system. "Ma'am, this changes everything about this complaint," the younger officer said. "Someone filed a false police report against the superintendent of state police." Sarah nodded grimly. "It appears that way, and I suspect there may be a pattern of harassment that extends beyond this morning's incident." From across the lake, I could see Karen still watching through her binoculars. But something had changed in the officers' behavior that she could not quite understand. They were treating Sarah with a level of respect that seemed disproportionate to a simple trespassing complaint. The third vehicle's door opened, and a woman in a business suit stepped out. She approached our group with the confident stride of someone accustomed to command. "Superintendent Mitchell," she said, extending her hand. "Captain Rodriguez, Internal Affairs. I came as soon as I received your call." "Captain, thank you for responding so quickly." The local officers looked confused. "Ma'am, if you do not mind me asking, why is Internal Affairs involved in a neighbor dispute?" Sarah's expression hardened. because someone has been systematically harassing a state police officer and filing false reports against her. That makes this more than a simple neighbor dispute. Captain Rodriguez pulled out a tablet and began taking notes. Superintendent, can you walk me through the timeline of harassment you have experienced? For the next hour, Sarah methodically documented Karen's campaign of violations, threats, and escalating harassment. She showed the captain photographs, violation notices, and the timeline of increasingly aggressive behavior. And this morning's false police report was the culmination of this harassment, Captain Rodriguez asked. It appears so. The complainant alleged that I was illegally occupying my own property due to unpaid HOA fines. The local officers exchanged uncomfortable glances. They were beginning to realize they had been used as weapons in Karen's harassment campaign. "Ma'am," the lead officer said quietly, "we owe you an apology. We should have investigated this complaint more thoroughly before responding." Sarah shook her head. "You responded appropriately to a complaint. The problem is not with your response. The problem is with someone who thought they could manipulate law enforcement to intimidate a private citizen." Across the lake, Karen was no longer watching casually. She was packing on her deck, clearly agitated by the extended police presence. The confident smugness was gone, replaced by visible anxiety. "What happens now?" I asked. Captain Rodriguez looked up from her tablet. "Now we investigate. Filing false police reports is a serious crime. Harassment of a law enforcement officer carries additional penalties, and if there is a pattern of this behavior, we may be looking at multiple charges." Sarah remained calm, but I could see the steel in her eyes. "I want this handled by the book, Captain. No special treatment, no shortcuts. I want a full investigation using standard procedures." "Understood, Superintendent. We will treat this like any other case of harassment and false reporting." As the officers prepared to leave, the lead patrolman approached Sarah one more time. "Ma'am, I have to ask, why did you not identify yourself earlier? This could have been resolved much more quickly." Sarah looked across the lake toward Karen's house. "Because I wanted to see how far she would take this. I needed to know if she was just a troublemaker or if she was willing to commit crimes to get what she wanted." The answer was clear now. Karen had crossed every line, broken multiple laws, and done it all while targeting someone she thought was powerless to fight back. She had been very, very wrong. The investigation moved with the efficiency of a well-oiled machine. Within 48 hours, Captain Rodriguez had assembled a team of investigators who began documenting every aspect of Karen's harassment campaign. What they found was staggering. Karen had not just been harassing us. She had been systematically targeting multiple families in the lake community over the past 3 years, using her self-appointed position as HOA compliance officer to intimidate anyone who did not meet her standards. She kept meticulous records, Captain Rodriguez told us during a follow-up meeting. Photographs, time logs, correspondence. She documented everything she did to harass her neighbors. The irony was perfect. Karen's obsessive record-keeping, which she had used as weapons against us, had become evidence of her own criminal behavior. The harassment charges were just the beginning. Investigators discovered Karen had filed false police reports against 3 other families in the past 2 years. She had claimed property violations, noise complaints, and even suspected criminal activity, all fabricated to pressure people into leaving the community. She was operating like a one-woman crime syndicate, one investigator explained. Using false reports, intimidation, and harassment to control an entire neighborhood. But the case against Karen became even stronger when other neighbors finally found the courage to come forward. The elderly couple across the cove revealed that Karen had threatened to have their property condemned if they did not remove their bird feeders. The Johnsons admitted they had stopped talking to us because Karen had convinced them we were dangerous city people who were planning to turn the lake into a party destination. She had everyone scared, Mrs. Johnson told the investigators. She said she had connections in the government and could make trouble for anyone who crossed her. The legal consequences came swift and severe. Karen was charged with filing false police reports, criminal harassment, intimidation, and conspiracy to interfere with property rights. Each charge carried significant fines and potential jail time. Her first reaction was denial. When officers arrived at her house with a warrant, she insisted there had been some misunderstanding. "I was just trying to maintain community standards," she told them. "These people do not belong here. They are destroying our property values." But when she learned that her primary target was the superintendent of state police, her attitude changed dramatically. The phone calls started that same evening. Karen called our house 6 times, begging to speak with Sarah. When that failed, she left voicemail messages that grew increasingly desperate. "I did not know," she pleaded in one message. "If I had known who you were, I never would have. Please, we can work this out. I made a mistake." Sarah listened to the messages with cold professional detachment. "She is making it worse," she observed. "Those calls are additional evidence of harassment." Karen's lawyer advised her to stop calling, but the damage was done. The recorded messages became part of the evidence file, showing that her harassment continued even after she knew she was under investigation. The most satisfying moment came when Karen's own documentation was used against her in court. She had photographed our property over 200 times in 6 months, timed our activities, and kept detailed logs of our violations. The prosecutor presented this evidence as proof of systematic stalking and harassment. The defendant treated her neighbors like criminals, the prosecutor argued. She surveilled them, documented their activities, and used law enforcement as her personal enforcement arm. This is not community activism. This is criminal behavior. Karen's defense attorney tried to argue that she was simply a concerned neighbor looking out for property values, but the evidence was overwhelming. Her own records showed the calculated nature of her harassment campaign. The other victims who came forward made the case even stronger. Mrs. Peterson, an elderly widow, testified that Karen had filed false reports claiming she was operating an illegal boarding house because she had her grandchildren visit for a week each summer. "She made my life a nightmare," Mrs. Peterson said through tears. "I was afraid to have my own family visit because she would call the police on them." The pattern was clear. Karen had used her perceived authority and false police reports to terrorize anyone who did not conform to her vision of how the lake community should operate. When the judge delivered the sentence, Karen finally understood the full consequences of her actions. She was found guilty on all charges and sentenced to 6 months in jail, 3 years of probation, and $15,000 in fines and restitution. But the legal consequences were just the beginning. The HOA board, horrified by the criminal charges, immediately revoked Karen's self-appointed position and banned her from any official role in the community. Her house, which she had leveraged to pay for her legal defense, went up for sale within a month. The final blow came when the state police investigation revealed that Karen had been claiming to have law enforcement connections, while harassing her neighbors. She had been using her perceived relationship with police to intimidate people, never realizing that her primary target actually was law enforcement. She thought she was playing a game, Captain Rodriguez explained. She thought she could manipulate the system to get what she wanted. She never considered that someone might be able to fight back. As we watched Karen's house sell and her moving truck disappear down the lake road, I felt a satisfaction I had never experienced before. This was not revenge. This was justice. Karen had faced the consequences of her actions through the proper legal channels, exactly as it should be. The woman who had tried to destroy our peace had destroyed herself instead. 6 months after Karen's conviction, Crystal Lake had transformed back into the peaceful community we had originally fallen in love with. The change was remarkable and immediate. Mrs. Peterson started having her grandchildren visit again, and their laughter could be heard echoing across the water during summer evenings. The Johnsons brought us fresh tomatoes from their garden and apologized for the months of silence. The elderly couple across the cove resumed their friendly waves and even invited us over for dinner. It is like everyone can breathe again, Sarah observed one evening as we sat on our dock watching the sunset. The new HOA board, elected after Karen's removal, adopted a completely different approach to community management. They focused on actual community building rather than harassment. Reasonable rules were maintained, but the atmosphere of fear and intimidation was gone. Our dock umbrella remained blue and white striped. Our kayaks stayed stored exactly where we wanted them. Our fire pit burned every weekend without complaint. The simple pleasures that Karen had tried to deny us became routine again. But the most significant change was in Sarah herself. The stress that had been building during Karen's harassment campaign melted away. She started taking longer weekends at the cabin, inviting friends and family to visit without fear of retaliation. I had forgotten how much I needed this place. She told me one morning as we sat drinking coffee in the exact spot where the police had first arrived to investigate Karen's false report. The lake community rallied around us in ways that surprised and touched us both. Neighbors who had been afraid to speak up during Karen's reign of terror now made an effort to be welcoming and friendly. We were invited to potluck dinners, boat trips, and community events. "You saved all of us," Mrs. Johnson told Sarah during one of these gatherings. She was making everyone miserable, but nobody knew how to stop her. Sarah's response was typically modest. "I just used the tools available to me. Anyone could have filed complaints about harassment." But that was not entirely true. Sarah's position and knowledge of law enforcement procedures had been crucial in building the case against Karen. More importantly, her patience and strategic thinking had allowed Karen to escalate her behavior to the point where criminal charges were inevitable. As autumn returned to the lake, Sarah and I spent our evenings talking about the lessons learned from our ordeal. The experience had taught us both about the importance of standing up to bullies and the power of using proper legal channels to address harassment. "The system works when people are willing to use it," Sarah reflected. Karen thought she could manipulate law enforcement to intimidate people. She never considered that someone might know how to fight back using the same system. Our lake cabin had become more than just a retreat. It had become a symbol of what happens when good people refuse to be intimidated by bullies. The peaceful water, the calling loons, and the quiet evenings had been restored, but now they felt more precious because we had almost lost them. As I write this story, 2 years have passed since Karen's conviction. Crystal Lake remains the peaceful sanctuary we had dreamed of, and Sarah continues to serve as superintendent of state police. We have learned that sometimes the best revenge is simply allowing bullies to face the natural consequences of their actions. The woman who tried to destroy our paradise ended up destroying herself instead. And sometimes, that is exactly how justice is supposed to work.